Anyone who has spent any length of time in the ball python industry knows that it is incredibly common for reptile breeders to get out of the breeding hobby before they hit their 5-year mark. So when this gets brought up, I think that it is often used as a way to deter new breeders from even attempting to start a ball python breeding business. Because the implication is that if the majority of people can't make it 5 years, what makes you think as a new ball python breeder that you are going to be any different? And what we wanted to do with this week's video is we wanted to dive into this topic as much as we can, because it's kind of hard to get some data around it, and compare the reptile industry to all other industries and look at the failure rates of businesses across the spectrum. In addition, we want to talk about the differences between descriptive statistics and inferential statistics, because I think that there might be some misunderstandings, and that might be what's fueling some of the rhetoric when it comes into the failure rates of ball python breeders. Anyways, my name's Steven with Leviathan, and let's get to it. To kick us off, we need to get some baselines, and the most important baseline is, in my opinion, probably the weakest part of this entire video, because I am not aware of a good way to get data on it, and that is the true failure rate of ball python businesses. And the way that we're going to describe failure rate in this video, because everybody can have different criteria for what's success and what's failure, but that is going to be a business that stops all of its operations from a business standpoint within the first 5 years. And yes, it is completely possible for a business to close at 6 years, but in this definition, that is going to be a successful ball python business. And it's also possible that you could have a business that goes for 20 years and it never actually breaks a profit, and maybe it's not actually successful, but again, that doesn't fall into the definition because of what we're going to be comparing it to. So with this, again, I don't know if there is a good source of data on it, but I'm going to guesstimate, and I'm going to say between 50 and 70% of all ball python breeders fail. They get out of trying to do a ball python breeding business. This doesn't mean that they don't own other reptiles or that they don't keep ball pythons as pets, but they stop trying to do it as a business within the first 5 years. Again, I am completely pulling that out of nowhere, but I'm going to say 50 to 70% of ball python breeders. When we are going to be looking at all other businesses, we have a couple different sectors that we're going to drill down, and we're also going to be looking at averages across the spectrum. And our data from this is going to be coming from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, specifically data that was published that covers 2023 and back. The very first data point that I want to discuss from this US Bureau of Labor Statistics is that they say that in 2023, across all of 2023, that there was 23.2% of all private sector's businesses that failed within their first year. So that means that about 1 in every 4, 1 in every 5, in between there, of all businesses, regardless of the sector, fail within their very first year. And when I think you're looking at the ball python industry, I don't know if this is actually true. I think that there might be a higher success rate in the very first year for the ball python world than other industries, and I don't think that that necessarily has anything to do with the idea that ball pythons are inherently better. But for the most part, when people start their ball python breeding business, they are buying a bunch of animals and they're not necessarily producing anything, because they still need to wait 2 to 3 years to grow them up. So with this in mind, I think that what ends up happening is the whole first year, most people, unless there's outside extenuating circumstances, stay in the hobby because they're still growing and they haven't been presented with a situation that would drive them out of the hobby yet. There are 3 other industries that it drills down to that I feel like that you could somewhat say that ball pythons or the reptile industry could fit into. And that is agriculture, retail sales, and wholesale sales. And the reason why I say wholesale sales is because there is a section of the hobby, there is a model in the hobby where people produce a large amount of animals, they sell them to wholesalers, and they never really deal with the public. And while I don't think that that model is as popular popular now in 2025 as it used to be maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I do think that that is somewhat of a model, and that still is an outlet for people to sell animals. So because of that, I'm going to be including those numbers here as well. When we look at the 5-year mark, overall, across all sectors of industry, there is a 48% failure rate of businesses going out of business within the very first 5 years. But when you are looking at agriculture, it is significantly lower at 34.8%. When you look at the retail failure rate at year 5, we are looking at 40.2%. And when we are looking at the wholesale business failure rate at year 5, it is just under 50%. So with all this out of the way, I want to try to summarize the top line as accurately as I can. And that is, of all businesses that started within 5 years before the end of 2023, 48% of them failed and were out of business by the end of 2023, and 52% were still in business going into 2024. So with this, I don't think, at least on the surface, that that is wildly different than what I think the failure rate is in the reptile hobby. And again, we don't have good data specifically on breeding ball pythons or really any other reptile species, but if we are looking at it as being a blend somewhere between agriculture, retail, and wholesale, with some of them being significantly lower and some of them being a little bit higher than the average, I think if we go off of the average, I think that that is somewhat of a safe point. So I still think that the idea of 48%, again, as best as we can kind of guesstimate on this, of reptile breeders go out of business in their first 5 years is about the most accurate way that I can gauge for a number right now. There likely are additional factors that are not being included in these statistics, and that is that the data is coming from the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics. So unless a business is actually operating as a legitimate business, that is the only way that they're going to come into these numbers. And we all know that there is a large portion of reptile breeders who don't operate as actual businesses. So therefore, their numbers may not be as accurately represented in this data, regardless of whether or not they were counting themselves as agriculture, retail, or wholesale. And therefore, it is going to introduce a bit of uncertainty into this data, even though we're just using it as a guesstimate. In addition, there are people who initially decide that they want to try to do it as a full-time business, and then decided that they still want to stay in the hobby, but maybe they're only going to breed 1 to 10 clutches and just do it as a hobby. So they might still be in business, but they don't have any intention of taking it full-time. And I don't know if that type of person counts as somebody who went out of business because they're not trying to do it as a true business anymore, and now it's just a hobby, or if that person is actually still in the industry when it comes to data like this. But again, all of this is rough and we are just using this as a guesstimate, and I still think that 48% is as best of a number as we are going to get. At lunch today, I was talking to Courtney about a lot of these different statistics as I was making notes for this video. And one of the things that she brought up is that these are descriptive statistics and they are not necessarily inferential statistics. And I had no idea what these meant because I don't have a statistics degree like Courtney does. So she explained it, and that is that descriptive statistics are things that describe, and I know that kind of sounds wild, of an entire whole. And inferential statistics are things that you can use to make inferences and oftentimes are used to predict things in the future. And this might sound like you can take descriptive statistics and use that to make inferences, which does happen. But the problem is, if you use a descriptive statistic as an inferential statistic, it might not be accurate given your specific circumstance. In order to illustrate how descriptive statistics might not lead to accurate inferences, we want to look at eye color in the United States. So, if you look at the entire population of the United States, 27% of the population has blue eyes. And because blue eyes are a recessive trait, which means that they are homozygous for blue eyes, so little b, little b. Now, if you have a couple, a man and a woman, who both have blue eyes, they're both homozygous for blue eyes, and they have a baby, that does not mean that the baby has a 27% chance to get blue eyes, because 27% of all of the United States population has blue eyes. Instead, because of the specific context of that baby has a 100% chance to get blue eyes. And this is how a descriptive statistic can lead to an incorrect inference. It doesn't always take into the context of the individual circumstances of any given situation, but if you look at it from a macro level, not at an individual level, it is likely to be an accurate representation of, in this case, the entire population of the United States. Taking this example and translating it back to the ball python world, we are saying that roughly 48% of all ball python businesses go out of business in the first 5 years. So this might seem on the surface that any person who starts a reptile business has about a 50-50 chance on whether or not they're still going to be around 5 years later. But again, the 48% is a descriptive statistic, and it's not necessarily a predictive one. So when we are looking at this, there are some people in that 48% who failed to have a ball python business 5 years down the road because maybe they didn't go about it in the right way. Maybe they maxed every single credit card that they had, and then before they were able to start producing babies, they got crushed by the interest payments, and with all of this said, something came up in their normal life and they ended up getting out in year 2. Also, there could be people who did everything the exact right way in their reptile breeding business, but in year 4, they had a rack fire that burned down their entire house, and while insurance may have covered their new home, it didn't cover the value of the animals, and rather than starting over from scratch, they decide to just get out of the industry. Either one of these scenarios could be factoring into the 48% that got out of the reptile industry. But that doesn't mean that it's a straight up coin flip, because individual people have an influence on their outcome. So if we're looking at the 52% of people who stay in business after 5 years, maybe some of them did it the exact right way, they got super lucky and they picked the exact right animals, the exact right morphs, they got super lucky on the odds, and they ultimately just killed it. And maybe there are some people who had a little bit of luck, but just really, really worked hard and were so stubborn and refused to quit that they're still in it 5 years later, even though they might not be profitable. And in either one of these situations, the individual's actions are the ones that determine whether or not they are still in 5 years later, and it's not a random spin of the roulette wheel. And I think that this is the thing that I really want to drive home in this video, is that when you hear things like the majority of ball python breeders don't last 5 years. One, I don't actually think that that's quite true, but it's close enough. 2 is just because a lot of other people didn't stay in for 5 years does not mean that every single new breeder who gets into the hobby is also going to get out. But as we say it all the time when we talk about things like this, in order to be successful, in order to have a thriving reptile business, there is a ton of work that a lot of people don't realize when you are first getting in, when you are first buying your animals and you are super, super excited. And I think that this work and this realization that comes later on is a lot of times the reason that drives people out, because they don't feel like it is worth all of the effort that they are putting into it. But if you love the animals, if you love the hobby, and you just want to keep breeding, I personally think that it is entirely possible to breed ball pythons, to breed reptiles, essentially as long as you want. And if you look at the things that are within your control and you do everything you can to develop your skills and to make smart investments and to maybe get a little bit of luck, whether that comes from picking the right animals or hitting the odds when it really, really matters, there is a ton of evidence that you can do reptiles as a thriving business. Anyways, we hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe, and we will see you next time.